The Vanishing Party Guest Day Story of Memory and Impermanence. Before we start tonight's tale, take the time to like this video and subscribe to my channel to never miss one of my new stories. Settle yourself comfortably. Let your breathing slow. Allow the tensions of the day to drift away like leaves on a gentle stream. Close your eyes if you wish, and let yourself be carried back through the past at the end of the year. The champagne flutes caught the amber glow of string lights as midnight approached. Sarah Chen stood near the kitchen island of her Brooklyn brownstone, watching the crowd of faces, some familiar, some less so, as they swirled through rooms that had witnessed 12 years of New Year's Eve celebrations. This gathering had become something of a tradition, a ritual anchored in the chaos of another year ending. Outside, the December wind pressed against the windows. Inside, warmth and laughter created their own atmosphere, that peculiar electricity that comes when strangers and friends alike gather to witness time's arbitrary division, to mark the moment when one number becomes another. Sarah had invited 40 people. Perhaps 50 had come. That was how these things went. Friends bringing friends, plus ones appearing unexpectedly, the permeable boundaries of celebration. She didn't mind. The more voices, the less likely she was to think too deeply about the year passing, about what she'd meant to accomplish, about promises made to herself in quieter moments. She was refilling the ice bucket when she first saw him. He stood near the bookshelf in the living room, examining the spines with the careful attention of someone who actually read titles rather than simply scanning them. Mid-40s, perhaps. Dark hair graying at the temples. A wool cardigan that looked expensive but worn, the kind of thing that ages with dignity. There was something in his posture, a stillness, that set him apart from the animated conversations happening around him. Sarah tried to place him. Had Marcus brought him? Or was he Amanda's new boyfriend? The faces at these parties had a way of blurring together after enough champagne and enough years. As if sensing her attention, the man looked up. His eyes met hers across the room, deep brown, contemplative, and he smiled. Not the broad, performative smile of party small talk, but something gentler. Something that suggested recognition. Sarah found herself smiling back before she could think about it. The familiar stranger. She wound her way through the crowd, nodding at conversations, refilling a glass here, laughing at a joke there, but moving steadily toward the bookshelf. When she reached him, he had pulled out a volume, Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude, and was holding it with a familiar reverence. "Good choice," Sarah said, "though maybe not the best party reading." He looked up, and that smile returned. "I don't know. All the best parties contain multitudes, don't they? Different time periods overlapping, stories bleeding into each other. It's not so different from Macondo." His voice carried a slight accent she couldn't quite place. British, perhaps, or someone who'd lived in many places and absorbed various cadences. "I'm Sarah," she said, extending her hand. "I live here. Well, obviously, since it's my party." "Thomas," he replied, taking her hand. His grip was firm but brief, and his hand was remarkably cold. "Thank you for having me." "Of course. How do you know?" She let the question trail off, the standard party inquiry. "Amanda," he said smoothly. "We met at a gallery opening last month. She mentioned you were hosting tonight and said I should come. I hope that's all right." "Absolutely," Sarah said, though she made a mental note to ask Amanda later. She didn't remember her mentioning anyone named Thomas. Are you an artist? In a manner of speaking, I work with memory. He slid the book back onto the shelf, his fingers lingering on the spine. I restore old photographs, salvage damaged family archives, that sort of thing. People come to me with what they think is lost, and I try to bring it back. That sounds almost like magic. It feels that way sometimes, Thomas agreed, though it's really just patience and chemistry, and an understanding that nothing is ever truly gone. It just changes form. There was something in the way he said it that made Sarah's skin prickle, though not unpleasantly. Around them, the party continued its chaotic symphony, laughter, music, the clink of glasses, the murmur of a dozen overlapping conversations. But in this small pocket near the bookshelf, time seemed to move differently. "You've lived here a while," Thomas observed, gesturing to the apartment. "I can tell." 12 years, Sarah confirmed. "How can you tell?" "The layers," he said simply. "Different paint colors showing through where the walls been nicked. Books arranged not alphabetically but by when you acquired them. I can see the progression of your reading tastes. That photograph on the mantel is from at least 10 years ago, judging by the furniture visible in the background and the photo quality. A life leaves traces. Accumulations." Sarah found herself looking at her own apartment with fresh eyes, seeing the archaeological record Thomas described. He was right. The painting she'd bought after her mother died. The rug she'd splurged on after the promotion. The coffee table with the water stain from the night she and David had gotten drunk and talked until dawn, before he moved to California. "You notice things," she said. "Occupational hazard," Thomas replied. "In my work, you learn to read what's been left behind. The invisible made visible, in a way. Conversations that linger. They talked for what felt like 20 minutes but might have been longer. Time had that slippery quality at parties, especially as midnight approached. Thomas told her about a project he was working on, a collection of Civil War-era daguerreotypes from an estate sale, faces frozen in silver, their stories lost. "The haunting thing," he said, "is that photography was so new then. Sitting for a portrait meant something. You were capturing a moment you knew you'd never return to. Your own face would age, change, but that image would remain exactly as it was. A kind of immortality, but also a kind of death. You're preserving the person you were, which means acknowledging that person will cease to exist." Sarah thought about that. "I've never liked photos of myself." "Most people don't," Thomas said. "Because we know what the camera doesn't, all the moments before and after, the full context. A photograph is a lie in that sense. Or maybe a very specific truth." Around them, someone turned up the music. Marcus was corralling people toward the living room, preparing for the countdown. Sarah glanced at her phone. 11:47 p.m. "We should probably join them," she said, though she found herself oddly reluctant. "In a moment," Thomas said. "I wanted to ask you something. That photograph on the mantel, the one from New Year's Eve, I think, 10 or 11 years ago. You're wearing a blue dress, and there's a man with his arm around you." Sarah turned to look at the photograph he meant. She was surprised he'd noticed it. It was half hidden behind other frames, visible only from certain angles. In the image, she was laughing, her head tilted back, David's arm around her shoulders. They'd been so young then, or what felt young from this distance. So certain about things that later proved uncertain. My friend David, she said. He moved away. You still miss him, Thomas observed. It wasn't a question. Yes, Sarah admitted. Is that strange? It's been years. Not strange at all, Thomas said quietly. Some absences never quite fill in. They remain as a kind of negative space, shaping everything around them. The people we lose, whether to distance or death or simply time passing, they still occupy a place in our lives. Perhaps that's what haunts us most. Not ghosts, but gaps. There was something in his voice that made Sarah study him more closely. In the warm lamplight, she realized he looked tired, not sleepy, but weary in some deeper way, the exhaustion that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time. Are you all right? She asked. Thomas smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. That's a complicated question on New Year's Eve, isn't it? We're all standing on the edge of something. Looking back, looking forward, trying to make sense of where we've been and where we're going. Before Sarah could respond, Amanda appeared at her elbow, slightly drunk and effusively cheerful. Sarah, there you are. We need you for the countdown. She glanced at Thomas, her brow furrowing slightly. Oh, hey. Are you having a good time? Very much so, Thomas said warmly. Thank you again for suggesting I come. Amanda's expression flickered, confusion, perhaps, or uncertainty, but then Marcus was calling for everyone to gather, and the moment passed. The hour approaches. The living room had become a press of bodies, everyone clutching glasses of champagne that Sarah and Marcus had hastily poured. Someone had connected their phone to the speakers, and the television on the wall showed the coverage from Times Square, the crystal ball suspended in the cold New York night, waiting for its annual descent. Sarah found herself separated from Thomas in the crush. She caught glimpses of him across the room, that gray cardigan visible between shoulders and raised arms. He seemed content to stand at the periphery, observing rather than participating in the collective anticipation. Her friend Rebecca, slightly drunk, was explaining a theory about New Year's Eve being a culturally agreed-upon liminal space. Think about it, she said, gesturing with her champagne. Midnight is already a threshold, right? Neither yesterday nor tomorrow. But New Year's Eve midnight is even more charged because it's not just any day, it's the edge of an entire year. We're literally between one period of time and another. No wonder weird things happen. What kind of weird things? Someone asked. Ghost sightings spike around New Year's, Rebecca said with the confidence of someone who'd read something somewhere once. Something about thresholds and transitions. The veil being thin or whatever. Sarah half listened, her attention divided. Across the room, Thomas was talking with an older couple she didn't recognize, friends of friends, probably. He seemed to be listening intently to something the woman was saying, his expression sympathetic. The television showed the clock in Times Square, 11:58 p.m. Someone handed Sarah a fresh glass of champagne. The bubbles caught the light, tiny universes expanding and collapsing in golden liquid. She thought about what Thomas had said about photographs, about preservation and loss, about gaps that never quite fill in. The countdown began. 10, 9, 8. The room's energy coalesced into a single point, all those individual voices becoming one voice, all those separate trajectories converging on a single moment. Sarah found herself shouting along, caught up in the ritual despite herself. 7, 6, 5. She looked for Thomas again and found him. He was watching her, not the television. There was something in his expression she couldn't quite read. Sadness, maybe, or nostalgia. Or perhaps just the weight of too many New Year's Eves, too many endings and beginnings blurring together.
4, 3, 2.
For a heartbeat, their eyes met across the crowded room. Thomas raised his glass slightly, a private toast.
Sarah raised hers in return.
1.
Happy New Year.
The room exploded into noise, cheers, the pop of champagne corks, Auld Lang Syne beginning to play, people embracing and kissing and laughing.
Confetti that someone had somehow produced floated through the air like snow.
Sarah blinked, letting the moment wash over her. When she opened her eyes and looked back to where Thomas had been standing, the space was empty. The absence. She told herself he'd just moved, swept up in the crowd, gone to refill his drink or use the bathroom. The party continued its celebration around her. Marcus kissing his boyfriend, Rebecca crying happy tears for reasons she probably couldn't articulate, strangers becoming friends in the way that only happens at midnight on New Year's Eve. But as the initial explosion of celebration settled into something more sustained, Sarah found herself looking for that gray cardigan, those contemplative brown eyes. She circulated through the apartment, smiling and accepting well wishes, but always scanning.
He wasn't in the kitchen.
Not on the small balcony where smokers huddled against the cold.
Not in the bathroom line or the bedroom where coats were piled.
"Have you seen Thomas?" she asked Amanda when she found her in the kitchen, eating cheese directly from the block. Amanda looked up, confused.
"Who?" "Thomas. The guy you brought?"
Gray cardigan, dark hair.
Amanda's brow furrowed.
"I didn't bring anyone tonight. Jake couldn't make it, remember? He's visiting his parents in Connecticut."
"No, not Jake. Thomas.
He said he met you at a gallery opening and you invited him."
Amanda shook her head slowly.
"Sarah, I haven't been to a gallery opening in months. And I definitely didn't invite anyone named Thomas." A cold feeling was spreading through Sarah's chest, though she couldn't have said why. But he was here.
"I talked to him for like half an hour."
"He was standing by the bookshelf when I first saw him. Maybe he came with someone else,"
Amanda suggested.
"Or maybe he crashed. People do that sometimes at New Year's." Sarah nodded, though the explanation felt wrong somehow. She remembered the specificity of their conversation, the way Thomas had noticed the photograph on the mantel, his observations about her apartment.
He hadn't seemed like someone who'd wandered in off the street.
She asked a few other people, but no one remembered seeing anyone matching Thomas's description. Marcus thought maybe he'd seen someone in a cardigan earlier, but couldn't be sure. The party had been crowded, and everyone had been drinking. Why does it matter so much?
Marcus asked gently.
"Did something happen?"
"No," Sarah said.
We had an interesting conversation. I wanted to continue it."
But it was more than that, though she couldn't quite articulate what.
There had been something about Thomas, a quality of attention, of presence, that had made their conversation feel significant in a way that transcended normal party small talk. And now he was simply gone, as if he'd never been there at all.
The party wound down around 2 a.m.
People called cars, bundled into coats, spilled out into the cold January morning with promises to text and meet up and do this again soon. Sarah helped clean up in a distracted way, her mind still turning over the puzzle of the vanishing guest. As she was collecting glasses from the living room, she noticed something on the bookshelf. The Garcia Marquez was pulled slightly out from the others, as if someone had recently been looking at it.
She pulled it out fully and opened it.
On the title page, in handwriting she didn't recognize, was an inscription. For Sarah, may you find what you're looking for in these pages. All the best, Thomas. The 1st of January, 13.
The date stopped her cold.
January 1st, 2013.
12 years ago. But that couldn't be right.
The book had been on her shelf for years, but she'd bought it used from a bookstore in Manhattan.
She would have noticed an inscription.
Wouldn't she? Sarah stood there in her quiet apartment, holding the book, the first morning of the new year pressing against the windows. And for the first time since Thomas had disappeared, she felt something beyond confusion.
She felt afraid.
Investigation. Sleep didn't come easily that night, or rather, that morning. Sarah lay in bed watching dawn light slowly fill her room, her mind replaying the conversation with Thomas, looking for clues she might have missed. "I work with memory," he'd said. "I restore old photographs, salvage damaged family archives."
It was specific enough to verify.
When the sun was fully up and the city outside had shaken off its New Year's stupor, Sarah opened her laptop and began searching. She started with the obvious, Thomas, photograph restoration, New York, but the results were too broad, too many Thomases doing too many things. She tried adding details from their conversation, Civil War daguerreotypes, estate sales, memory preservation.
Still nothing that matched.
Then she tried a different approach. She went back through her photos from previous New Year's Eve parties, the digital archive of a decade's worth of celebrations. Faces appeared and disappeared, friends who'd moved away, relationships that had ended, people she'd lost touch with. The archaeology of a life, as Thomas might have put it. In the photos from 2013, she found something that made her breath catch. It was a group photo, taken just after midnight. She was in it, wearing that blue dress from the photograph on the mantel. David had his arm around her shoulder. And standing slightly apart from the main group, half turned toward the camera as if someone had called his name just as the shutter clicked, was a man in a gray cardigan.
Thomas.
Sarah zoomed in on his face, but the image quality from 12 years ago, taken on a phone camera in low light, made it hard to be certain. The features were similar, the dark hair, the contemplative expression, but it could have been anyone. Couldn't it? She went through more photos from that night. Most didn't show him, but in a few backgrounds, in the spaces between the main subjects, she caught glimpses, a gray shoulder, a profile, someone standing by the bookshelf. How had she not remembered him? Sarah called Amanda. "I need you to look at something." 20 minutes later, Amanda was at her door with coffee and the worn look of someone who'd gotten very little sleep. Sarah showed her the photos on her laptop. "Do you remember this party?" Sarah asked. "From 2013. Amanda peered at the screen, squinting. "God, we all look so young. Is that Daniel? I'd forgotten he used to come to these. And Rachel before she moved to Portland." She pointed at various faces, naming them. Then her finger hovered over Thomas. "Wait, who's that?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." They went through all the photos from that night, but there were no clear shots of Thomas's face, nothing that would make identification certain. He was always peripheral, always slightly out of focus, as if he existed at the edge of attention. "It's weird," Amanda admitted. But maybe he was just someone's plus one who didn't get introduced around? That happens. But why would he come back 12 years later?
Sarah asked.
And why would no one remember him?
Amanda didn't have an answer for that.
The deep dive. Over the next few days, as the city settled back into its post-holiday routine, Sarah found herself unable to let it go. She went through old guest lists, trying to reconstruct who had been at the 2013 party. She reached out to people she hadn't talked to in years, asking if they remembered a man named Thomas in a gray cardigan.
No one did.
She searched obituaries, thinking maybe, though it seemed absurd, Thomas had been a ghost in some literal sense.
But the search was too broad, and she had too little to go on.
How many Thomases had died in New York in the past 12 years? How would she know which one, if any, was the right one? Then, on a cold afternoon about a week after New Year's, she was walking past a photo restoration shop in the West Village, the kind of place she'd walked past 100 times without noticing, and something made her stop. The shop was small, wedged between a coffee shop and a bookstore. The window displayed sample restorations, faded photographs brought back to vibrant life, torn images made whole, faces emerging from damage and time. A sign on the door said, McNulty and Associates, Photographic Restoration since 1994.
Something about the name triggered a memory.
Not from the recent party, but from deeper back.
She'd heard that name before.
Sarah pushed open the door, setting off a small bell. The shop's interior smelled of chemicals and old paper, an oddly comforting scent. An older woman looked up from behind the counter, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun.
"Can I help you?" she asked pleasantly.
"I'm looking for someone who might work here," Sarah said, feeling suddenly foolish. "A man named Thomas? He does photograph restoration." The woman's expression shifted, something complicated moving across her features. Surprise, perhaps, or sadness. "Thomas McNulty?" she asked quietly. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure. The name felt right. The woman was silent for a long moment, studying Sarah with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. Then she said, "How do you know Thomas?"
"I met him at a party," Sarah said, "on New Year's Eve.
He told me about his work, and I thought,
I wanted to follow up
about possibly having some photos restored." The woman, Mrs. McNulty, Sarah assumed, set down the photograph she'd been examining. "When was this party?"
"Last week.
New Year's Eve.
This year?"
"Yes."
Sarah felt a prickle of unease. "Why?"
Mrs. McNulty walked to a filing cabinet against the wall and pulled out a folder. From it, she extracted a photograph, a professional portrait, the kind taken for business purposes.
She laid it on the counter. Sarah's breath caught. It was Thomas.
Definitely Thomas. The same contemplative eyes, the same slight smile. The photograph showed him in a button-down shirt and tie, professional but approachable. And at the bottom, in printed text, Thomas McNulty, Master Photographic Restorer, 1971 to 2012.
"I don't understand," Sarah whispered.
"Thomas was my son," Mrs. McNulty said quietly.
"He died 13 years ago.
January 2nd, 2012. He was driving home from a New Year's Eve party in Brooklyn when his car hit a patch of black ice. The accident was instant. He wouldn't have suffered." The shop seemed to tilt around Sarah.
She gripped the counter for support. "But that's not possible," she said. I talked to him last week. He was at my party.
Mrs. McNulty's expression was sad but not disbelieving.
You live in Brooklyn? Near Prospect Park? Yes. How did you?
Because that's where the party was, Mrs. McNulty said. The last party Thomas attended before he died. It was at a friend's place, a brownstone near the park. He called me from there around 11 to wish me a happy new year. Said he was having a wonderful time. That he'd met someone interesting who reminded him why he loved this city.
She paused.
He died about an hour after midnight, driving home.
Sarah's mind was reeling.
The party from 2013.
That was my party.
My apartment. Then perhaps, Mrs. McNulty said gently, Thomas has been back to visit.
The pattern emerges.
Mrs. McNulty made tea, a gesture that seemed both mundane and necessary, something to anchor them to reality while discussing the impossible. They sat in the back room of the shop, surrounded by decades of photographs, faces frozen in silver and chemical stains. It's happened before, Mrs. McNulty said, wrapping her hands around her mug.
People who say they've seen Thomas.
It's always around New Year's Eve, and it's always in that neighborhood in Brooklyn. She pulled out more photographs, not professional portraits this time, but candid shots. Thomas at various ages, a teenager in the 90s, a young man in the early 2000s, and finally, as Sarah had seen him, in his early 40s, shortly before his death. He loved New Year's Eve, Mrs. McNulty continued. Used to say it was the one night when everyone was honest about time passing, when we all acknowledge together that we're moving forward whether we like it or not. He found something beautiful in that shared awareness. Sarah studied the photographs, looking for answers in Thomas's frozen smile.
Why would he come back?
If it's really him.
I've thought about that a lot, Mrs. McNulty admitted.
Thomas was?
She paused, choosing her words carefully. He was someone who paid attention.
Who noticed things other people missed. Details, moments, the small beauties that make up a life. His work wasn't just about restoring photographs. It was about recovering what people thought was lost. Proving that nothing is ever truly gone.
He said something similar, Sarah said quietly.
At the party. I think, Mrs. McNulty continued, that Thomas understood something about time that most of us don't. That it's not linear the way we imagine it. Those moments don't simply pass. They layer, they echo.
The past isn't behind us.
It's all around us, if we know how to look. She opened a drawer and pulled out a notebook, worn, leather-bound, pages filled with Thomas's handwriting.
I found this after he died.
He'd been keeping a kind of journal about his work, but also about time and memory. Some of it is technical notes, but other parts.
She flipped through pages. Here.
Listen to this. She read aloud. Every photograph I restore feels like reaching across time. The person who sat for this portrait is gone. Dead. Probably 4 decades, but I can bring their face back from the fog of damage and decay. In doing so, I'm giving them a kind of immortality they never asked for. I'm pulling them back into the present, making them visible again. Sometimes I wonder if it works the other way too. If the dead can reach forward, borrowing moments from the living, stepping into our now the way we step into theirs then. The words hung in the air between them. Outside, the winter afternoon was fading into dusk, the short January day already exhausted. There's more, Mrs. McNulty said, turning pages. He wrote this entry dated December 31st, the day he died, going to a party tonight in Brooklyn. I have this strange feeling, like I'm standing at a threshold between one thing and another. Not just the year ending, but something bigger. I keep thinking about that Borges story, The Garden of Forking Paths. What if time doesn't move in a single line but branches infinitely? What if every moment contains all possible moments? Maybe that's what New Year's Eve is really about. Not leaving one year and entering another, but standing at the junction of infinite paths, seeing all the ways our lives might unfold. Sarah felt tears prickling at her eyes, though she couldn't have said exactly why. He seemed sad, she said, when I talked to him. Not depressed, but melancholy, like he was carrying something heavy. The burden of seeing too clearly, perhaps, Mrs. McNulty said. Of understanding that every moment is both an ending and a beginning, and that we're powerless to stop any of it. They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling around them. Then Sarah remembered something. The book, she said suddenly. He left an inscription in my copy of 100 Years of Solitude, dated 2013, but I only found it after this year's party. Mrs. McNulty's expression shifted. Do you have it with you? Sarah shook her head. It's at home. Would you mind if I saw it? I'd like to see his handwriting again. They agreed to meet the next day. As Sarah was leaving, Mrs. McNulty called after her. Thank you, she said, for talking with him, for giving him that time, even if you didn't know what it was. I don't understand what happened, Sarah admitted. Neither do I, Mrs. McNulty replied. But I think Thomas was right about one thing. Nothing is ever truly gone. We just change form. The truth in pages. Sarah couldn't sleep again that night. She sat in her living room with the Garcia Marquez novel, reading the inscription over and over. For Sarah. May you find what you're looking for in these pages. All the best, Thomas. The 1st of January, 13. The handwriting was elegant, old-fashioned, the kind that came from a generation that still valued penmanship. She thought about what Mrs. McNulty had said, about time not being linear, about moments layering and echoing. What if Thomas had written this inscription 12 years ago, at her 2013 party, and she simply hadn't noticed until now? It seemed impossible that she would have bought a used book with a personalized message to her from a stranger and not seen it. But the memory was strange. Perhaps she had seen it, filed it away as curious but meaningless, and then forgotten until the night Thomas reappeared made it significant. Or perhaps, and this thought made her skin prickle, Thomas had somehow reached forward through time, knowing she would need this message in 2025. She opened the book randomly and began reading, letting Marquez's cyclical narrative of the Buendia family wash over her. The novel was itself about time's strange properties, about how the past, present, and future bleed into each other in Macondo, about how the dead linger in the lives of the living, not as ghosts but as absences that shape everything. Around 3 a.m., her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. This is Patricia McNulty. I couldn't sleep. I've been going through more of Thomas's notebooks. Can you come to the shop tomorrow morning? There's something you need to see. Sarah arrived at McNulty & Associates at 9 a.m., clutching coffee and the Garcia Marquez novel. Mrs. McNulty looked as exhausted as Sarah felt, but there was an intensity in her eyes that suggested something important. I found his calendar, Mrs. McNulty said without preamble. From 2012. He was meticulous about documenting his schedule, appointments, deadlines, social events. Everything. She spread the calendar pages on the counter, actual paper pages from a physical planner, filled with Thomas's neat handwriting. December 2012 showed various notations, client meetings, restoration deadlines, holiday plans. And on December 31st, circled in red ink, Sarah's party.
Prospect Park. 10 p.m.
Sarah's party, Mrs. McNulty repeated.
He wrote your name. Did you know him before that night?
No, Sarah said firmly. I'd never met him before. I'm sure of it. Then how did he know your name? They stared at each other, the question hanging between them.
Mrs. McNulty pulled out another notebook. This one is different.
I found it in a box I'd never opened. I think Thomas kept it separate, private. Look at the date. The notebook's cover page read, December 2024 to January 2025. But he died in 2012, Sarah whispered.
I know. Mrs. McNulty opened the notebook.
The first entry was dated December 15, 2024. The pull is stronger this year. I can feel the threshold approaching. New Year's Eve, 2024 into 2025. There's something about this particular transition. Maybe it's the quarter-century mark, or maybe it's just that the boundary is thinner there. I can feel myself reaching toward it, or perhaps it's reaching toward me. There's a woman at the party, Sarah. I remember her from last time, though I don't think she remembers me. Time works strangely at these moments. I think I need to talk to her again. To say something I didn't say before, or maybe to hear something I need to hear. The dead borrow moments from the living. That's what it feels like. We steal brief instances, fold ourselves into the spaces between seconds, and for just a little while, we're there again.
Present.
Real.
It doesn't last. It can't.
But maybe it doesn't need to.
Sarah's hands were shaking. This doesn't make sense.
How could he write this 2 years after he died? I don't know, Mrs. McNulty admitted. But there's more. The next entry, dated December 31st, 2024.
Tonight's the night. I can feel the path opening.
The brownstone in Prospect Park, the party Sarah hosts every year. I'll be there at the threshold, when midnight approaches. The moment between years, between states of being. I'm not haunting her. I want to be clear about that. I'm not trying to frighten anyone or prove ghosts exist. I need to be there. To have that conversation about memory and loss and how the past shapes us. To tell someone, even if they don't fully understand, that we don't simply vanish. That love and attention and care persist, even after we're gone. That the connections we make reverberate forward in ways we can't predict. Sarah looked up from a notebook, tears streaming down her face. I don't understand why he came to me. Why did it matter so much?
Mrs. McNulty's eyes were wet too.
Maybe because you listened. Maybe because in all the chaos of that party, in all the noise and celebration, you gave him your attention. You saw him as a person, not just another guest. For someone who exists between moments, borrowed from time, that must have meant everything. They spent the next hour going through more entries. The notebook documented other appearances, brief moments when Thomas had managed to cross over, always on New Year's Eve, always in that same neighborhood. Brief conversations with strangers, Moments of connection that left people with a sense of having met someone significant, even if they couldn't quite remember the details. And throughout all of it, references to Sarah's party,
to the brownstone,
to try to get the timing right, to line up the threshold so he could be there, fully present, for one more New Year's Eve. The final entry was dated January 1st, 2025, written in a shakier hand.
I saw her again. Sarah. We talked by the bookshelf, just like last time.
She didn't remember me from before, but that's all right. Memory is strange in these between places. I told her what I could about preservation and loss, about gaps that never fill in. I hope she understood what I was really trying to say, that her friend David, the one she still misses, that love doesn't disappear.
That I don't disappear.
We become part of the architecture of other people's lives, invisible supports holding up their worlds.
At midnight, I felt myself pulled back, the boundary closing.
But this time, I left something behind. The inscription in her book.
Maybe she'll find it. Maybe it will mean something.
Or maybe it's just my way of proving I was there, that for a little while, I was real again. The dead borrow moments from the living. But maybe the living borrow from the dead too, courage, wisdom, perspective. The understanding that time is short and precious and should be spent on what matters.
I think I'm done now. I think I can rest.
I said what I needed to say. Making sense of impossibility. Sarah and Mrs. McNulty sat with a notebook between them, neither speaking for a long time. The shop around them was quiet. No customers this early on a January morning, just the two of them and the accumulated evidence of something that shouldn't be possible. Finally, Sarah said, I don't know if I believe this. Any of this. But I also don't know how to explain it away. The rational part of me says there has to be an explanation, Mrs. McNulty said. That I wrote these entries myself, some kind of grief response. That you're misremembering, or that there was a real person at your party who just happened to resemble my son. The mind plays tricks.
But you don't believe that?
No, Mrs. McNulty said quietly.
I don't.
Because I know my son's handwriting better than my own. And because I've heard too many similar stories over the years to dismiss them all.
She pulled out another folder, this one containing letters and emails.
After Thomas died, people started reaching out. Strangers, mostly. People who said they'd seen him, talked to him, met him at parties or events.
Always around New Year's Eve. Always in Brooklyn. I thought they were mistaken or lying or delusional.
But there were too many of them, and their stories were too consistent. They all described the same things: his gray cardigan, his thoughtful manner, his interest in memory and time. And they all said the conversations felt significant in a way they couldn't quite explain.
Sarah thought about her own experience.
The way Thomas had seemed to see through surfaces to something deeper. The particular quality of attention he'd given her, as if their conversation mattered more than simple party small talk.
Why New Year's Eve? She asked.
Why that particular moment?
Mrs. McNulty referred back to the notebook. Thomas theorized about it here.
Look, this entry from December 20th. New Year's Eve is when the collective consciousness is most focused on time itself. Millions of people, all watching clocks, all waiting for that arbitrary moment when one number becomes another. That focused attention creates something, a kind of resonance or frequency. It's the same principle as how photography works. Light focused through a lens onto a sensitized surface, capturing what was there. Human attention, focused on a single moment, might work similarly. It might make the boundary between past and present more permeable, more crossable. That's actually based on something real, Sarah said slowly, her scientific background kicking in despite the impossibility of the situation. There's research on collective consciousness, the Global Consciousness Project at Princeton. They found that random number generators around the world show statistical anomalies during major global events, 9/11, New Year's Eve, moments when millions of people are focused on the same thing simultaneously. The data suggests that human consciousness might affect physical reality in measurable ways.
Mrs. McNulty nodded. Thomas was interested in that research. He saw connections between photography, quantum mechanics, and consciousness. He believed that observation changes reality, not metaphorically, but literally. Sarah remembered a lecture from her college physics class about the double-slit experiment, how particles behave differently when observed versus when unobserved. The observer effect. The idea that consciousness itself might play a role in determining physical reality. There's also the concept of temporal anomalies, Sarah continued, warming to the topic despite herself. Places where time seems to behave strangely. Physicists talk about closed time-like curves, wormholes, regions where the past and future might theoretically be accessible. What if certain locations, maybe because of geography, or human activity, or some other factor, create weak points in time? Places where past and present overlap. Your apartment might be one of those places, Mrs. McNulty suggested. That's where Thomas was heading when he died. His last thoughts, his last intentions, were focused on that location. Maybe some part of him remained there, or returned there, when the conditions were right. They discussed other possibilities, grasping for frameworks that might contain the impossible. Residual hauntings, where traumatic or emotionally significant events imprint themselves on locations. Quantum entanglement between past and present moments. The idea from parapsychology that consciousness might not be entirely bound by physical death, that some aspect of awareness could persist. There's also cultural precedent for this, Mrs. McNulty added. The Japanese have a concept called mono no aware, a sensitivity to the transience of things, an awareness that everything passes. They believe the dead can return during certain festivals, particularly Obon in August, but also at year's end. It's not frightening to them. It's natural, even beautiful. The dead return to visit the living, to maintain connections. Sarah pulled out her phone and did a quick search. There are similar traditions all over the world. In Mexico, Dia de los Muertos. In China, the Hungry Ghost Festival. Celtic Samhain, which inspired Halloween. All of them are based on the idea that there are thin times, threshold moments when the boundary between life and death becomes permeable. And in modern America, Mrs. McNulty said, we've lost most of that. We treat death as an ending, final and complete. We don't leave space for the possibility that the dead might linger, might need something, might have unfinished business. Is that what Thomas has? Unfinished business. Mrs. McNulty considered this. I don't think so. At least not in the vengeful ghost sense. I think Thomas understood something that most of us don't, that love persists, that the connections we make don't simply sever when we die. They transform, certainly, but they don't disappear. He's not haunting anyone. He's just visiting, maintaining the relationships that mattered to him. The science of ghosts. Over the following weeks, Sarah found herself diving deep into research. She read about the Global Consciousness Project, which has been collecting data since 1998 showing statistical deviations in random number generators during major world events. The implications were profound, that human consciousness might be a field that extends beyond individual brains, that focused collective attention might actually affect physical reality. She learned about the work of Dr. Dean Radin at the Institute of Newtic Sciences, who conducted experiments suggesting that human observation can influence quantum systems. His double-slit experiments using meditators showed that focused attention seemed to affect how particles behaved, not through any physical interaction, but through consciousness alone. She read about time perception research, how the brain constructs our sense of the present moment from sensory data that actually occurred milliseconds in the past. Neuroscientist David Eagleman's work showed that our experience of now is a constructed illusion, a narrative our brains create from time-delayed inputs. What we think of as the present is actually a synthesis of recent past events. This led her to theories about the nature of time itself. Einstein's relativity showed that past, present, and future all exist simultaneously in the four-dimensional space-time continuum. What we perceive as time's flow is an artifact of consciousness, not an objective feature of reality. The physicist Brian Greene's work on the block universe theory suggested that all moments, past, present, future, are equally real, existing together in a fixed structure. Time doesn't flow. Consciousness moves through it like reading a book, experiencing one page at a time even though all pages exist simultaneously. If that was true, if past moments still existed, preserved in space-time, then perhaps consciousness could access them under certain conditions. Perhaps Thomas hadn't returned from death so much as he'd found a way to experience a preserved moment over and over, to inhabit a slice of space-time where he was still alive, still present. She found research on deathbed visions and end-of-life experiences. Studies showed that a significant percentage of dying patients report seeing deceased loved ones in their final hours. Conventional medicine dismisses these as hallucinations caused by failing brains and medication. But researcher Peter Fenwick's work suggested these visions might serve a purpose, providing comfort, facilitating transition, perhaps even representing some genuine contact with the dead. The more Sarah read, the more she realized how little science actually understood about consciousness, time, and the nature of reality. The hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience arises from physical matter, remained unsolved. Quantum mechanics showed that reality at the smallest scales behaves in ways that defy common sense, with particles existing in multiple states until observed, with entangled particles affecting each other instantly across vast distances. Maybe, Sarah thought, the answer wasn't that Thomas's return was supernatural. Maybe it was natural, just part of a natural world far stranger than we normally acknowledge. The Memory Box. One evening in late January, Mrs. McNulty invited Sarah to her home in Queens. The apartment was exactly what Sarah had expected. Walls covered with photographs spanning decades, shelves full of books about photography, chemistry, history, art. Thomas's presence was everywhere, not as a shrine but as a natural part of the space. "I wanted to show you something," Mrs. McNulty said, leading Sarah to a bedroom that had clearly been Thomas's. It remained much as he'd left it. Books on the shelves, a desk with restoration equipment, photographs pinned to a corkboard. Mrs. McNulty opened a closet and pulled out a box. "I packed this up after he died but could never bring myself to go through it properly. After our conversation,
I thought maybe there would be answers here. Inside the box were notebooks, photographs, newspaper clippings, and various ephemera from Thomas's life. They sorted through it together, two women trying to understand a man who had managed to transcend death's boundary, at least temporarily. Sarah found a photograph that made her stop. It showed Thomas at a party, definitely a New Year's Eve party, judging by the decorations. He was laughing, champagne glass raised, surrounded by people. And in the background, slightly out of focus, was a bookshelf that Sarah recognized. Her bookshelf. In her apartment. When was this taken? She asked. Mrs. McNulty looked at the back of the photo. In Thomas's handwriting, New Year's Eve, 2011. Best party in years. Must remember this address. The year before he died. Which meant Thomas had been to Sarah's New Year's party twice while alive, 2011 and 2012, and then again in 2024 or 2025 after his death. But Sarah had no memory of him from any of those years. How was that possible? They found more photographs from that same party. In several of them, Sarah was visible, younger, with a different haircut, but unmistakably her. In one image, she and Thomas were both in frame, standing near the kitchen, though they didn't appear to be talking to each other. Memory is unreliable, Mrs. McNulty said quietly. Studies show that we don't remember events as they happened. We remember the last time we remember them, and each remembering changes the memory slightly. After enough time, after enough retellings, the memory might bear little resemblance to the original event. Sarah thought about the parties she'd hosted. Dozens of them over the years, hundreds of guests, thousands of conversations. How many faces had blurred together? How many people had she talked to briefly and then forgotten completely? And yet, Thomas had remembered her, had found her significant enough to write her name in his calendar, to note her address, to return even after death. Why me? Sarah asked. What made these parties, this apartment, important enough to come back to? Mrs. McNulty pulled out another notebook, this one older, from several years before Thomas's death. She flipped to a page marked with a ribbon bookmark. He wrote about it here, she said, handing the notebook to Sarah. The entry was dated December 27, 2011. Went to a party in Brooklyn last night that I can't stop thinking about. The host, Sarah, I think her name was, had this incredible collection of photographs displayed throughout her apartment. Not just family photos, but images she'd collected from flea markets and estate sales. Strangers' lives, frozen in time, curated and displayed as art. We talked about it briefly. She said she was drawn to photographs of people no one remembered anymore, faces without names, lives without context. She said every photograph was a small preservation, a way of saying you existed, you mattered, even if everything else about the person was lost. I've never heard anyone articulate what I do so perfectly. These are my people, the forgotten ones, the faded faces I bring back from decay. I told her I restore photographs professionally, and she got so excited, asked me 100 questions. Then someone called her away and I got pulled into another conversation, and we never reconnected. I left without getting her contact information. Stupid. But I have the address. I'll go back next year. Sarah's hands were trembling. She did collect old photographs. Still did. Her apartment walls were covered with them, anonymous faces from other eras staring out from ornate frames. She'd started the collection in her 20s, drawn to these orphaned images,
These people who had once been important to someone and were now just decorative objects in flea markets. You shared something with him, Mrs. McNulty said gently. A way of seeing the world, a reverence for preservation and memory. You gave his life's work a kind of meaning, even if you didn't know him well. Sometimes that's all it takes, one person who truly sees you, who understands what drives you, that can anchor you to a place, to a moment, more firmly than years of superficial acquaintance. Sarah thought about her conversation with Thomas on New Year's Eve. How he'd noticed the photograph of her and David on the mantel, how he'd understood the persistence of loss. How he talked about gaps that never fill in, about how the dead remain as negative space in the lives of the living. He'd been talking about himself, about his own absence, his own persistence in the spaces between moments. The final piece. It was mid-February when Sarah found the last piece of the puzzle, though she didn't realize its significance immediately. She was going through old social media posts, sparked by a comment from a friend about how different everyone looked back in the day. She scrolled back through her posts from January 2013, looking at photos from that year's New Year's Eve party. Most of the images were familiar. She'd been through them multiple times by now. But then she found something she'd missed before, a video. Just 15 seconds, shot on someone's phone, uploaded to her timeline and then forgotten for 12 years. The video showed her apartment from near the doorway, panning across the crowded room. The quality was poor, the lighting dim, but you could see people talking, laughing, and celebrating. And there, for just 3 seconds as the camera passed over the bookshelf area, was Thomas. Grey cardigan, drink in hand, talking to someone off camera. But what made Sarah's breath catch was that she could hear audio. The video had sound. She turned up the volume, straining to hear over the party noise. There, a fragment of conversation as the camera passed Thomas. The thing about photographs is they prove we were here, that we existed in this specific moment, at this specific place, even after we're gone. The camera moved on, the rest of the sentence lost to distance and ambient noise. Sarah played it again, and again, even after we're gone. He'd known. Even then, at that party in 2013, hours before his death, Thomas had known something, had been working towards something, had understood that he was approaching a threshold between states of being. She sent the video to Mrs. McNulty, who called her an hour later, crying. "Thank you," she said through tears. "Thank you for finding this, for letting me hear his voice again." They talked for a long time about what it meant, whether Thomas had somehow known his death was approaching, or whether the video's significance was something they were projecting onto it after the fact. Whether his words were prophetic or simply the ongoing preoccupation of someone who spent his life thinking about memory and preservation. "I think," Mrs. McNulty said finally, "that Thomas was always preparing for this. His whole life, his whole career, was about understanding how moments persist, how the past never truly passes. He wasn't afraid of death. He was curious about it, about whether consciousness could survive, whether connections could persist, whether love was stronger than endings." "And did it?" Sarah asked. "Did he find his answer?" "I think so," Mrs. McNulty said. "He came back. That's an answer, isn't it? Maybe not the kind we can prove scientifically or explain rationally, but an answer nonetheless." Endings and beginnings. Spring arrived, as it always did, with the tenacious optimism of green things pushing through cold earth. Sarah found herself thinking less frantically about Thomas, though he was never far from her thoughts. The mystery had settled into something she carried with her, a private knowledge that reality was stranger and more generous than she'd previously imagined. She met with Mrs. McNulty once a month, usually at the photo restoration shop. They'd have tea and talk about Thomas, about time, about the strange ways grief transforms over the years. Mrs. McNulty taught her some basic photo restoration techniques, and Sarah brought in some of her anonymous photographs to practice on. "You're giving them another life," Mrs. McNulty said, watching Sarah carefully clean a damaged daguerreotype of a woman from the 1850s. "That's what Thomas would say. You're not just preserving them, you're changing them, adding your own moment to their existence." When this woman sat for this portrait, she could never have imagined that in 2025, a stranger would carefully restore her image, would wonder about her life, would give her this attention. "It feels like a kind of conversation," Sarah agreed. "Across time. I'm saying to her, I see you. You mattered." And maybe she's saying something back. Maybe all these faces you've collected, all these anonymous lives, maybe they're trying to tell you something about persistence, about how we leave traces even when we think everything is lost. Sarah thought about the Garcia Marquez novel, still on her shelf with Thomas's inscription inside it. She'd read it cover to cover twice now, looking for whatever message Thomas had thought she needed. The novel's circular time structure, its ghosts and memories and dead who wouldn't stay buried, its insistence that the past was never truly past. Maybe that was the message. Or maybe the message was simpler. May you find what you're looking for. What had she been looking for? And had she found it? As New Year's Eve 2025 approached, Sarah considered not hosting her annual party. The thought of strangers in her apartment, of watching for a gray cardigan that wouldn't appear, felt unbearable. But Mrs. McNulty encouraged her to continue the tradition. "Thomas loved those parties," she said. "Not because they were fancy or exclusive, but because you created a space where people could mark time together, where connections could form, even briefly. Don't give that up." So Sarah sent out invitations. She cleaned her apartment, bought champagne, prepared for another year to end and another to begin. The night of the party, as guests began arriving, Sarah felt both nervous and calm. She didn't expect Thomas to appear. His notebook had suggested he was done, that he'd said what he needed to say. But she found herself looking anyway, hoping and not hoping in equal measure. Midnight approached. The countdown began. Sarah stood near the bookshelf. Where else? And raised her glass as the room erupted in celebration. Auld Lang Syne played. People embraced. Another year had passed, another year beginning. And Thomas didn't come. Sarah felt a complex mixture of relief and disappointment. Of course he didn't come. Why would he? She'd gotten her visitation, her impossible conversation. To expect more would be greedy. But as the party wound down, as guests began leaving around 2 a.m., Sarah found something on the bookshelf. A photograph she'd never seen before, tucked between books. It showed a party scene, her apartment, clearly, from the distinctive bookshelf and fireplace. In the image, people celebrated New Year's Eve, faces blurred by motion and joy. And in the corner, perfectly in focus, stood Thomas. Gray cardigan, slight smile, raising a glass toward the camera. Toward whoever was taking the photograph. Toward her. Sarah turned the photo over. In handwriting she now recognized a message. For all the moments we borrow, and all the ones we lend. Thank you for seeing me. T. She stood there in her quiet apartment, first light of the new year pressing against the windows, holding a photograph that shouldn't exist. And she understood, finally, what Thomas had been trying to tell her. We don't simply disappear. The connections we make, the attention we give, the ways we see and are seen, these things persist. They echo forward through time, creating ripples that touch lives we'll never know about, in moments we'll never witness. The dead borrow moments from the living, but the living borrow from the dead too. Courage, perspective, the knowledge that time is precious and should be spent on what matters. Thomas had given her that. And in return, she'd given him something equally valuable. A moment of being seen, of being recognized, of mattering to someone even across the boundary of death. It was a fair exchange. Epilogue: The Architecture of Memory. Years later, Sarah would still host her New Year's Eve parties. The tradition continued, grew, evolved. Friends brought friends, who became friends themselves, who brought their own friends. The apartment remained a threshold space, a place where one year ended and another began, where strangers became familiar and the familiar became strange. Thomas never appeared again, at least not that Sarah saw. But sometimes, in photographs taken at these parties, there would be curious things. A blur in the background that looked almost like a figure in a gray cardigan. A reflection in a window that showed someone who wasn't there. Anomalies that could be explained by camera glitches, by light and shadow, by the chaos of crowded rooms and low lighting. Or they could be something else. Sarah learned to live with uncertainty, with the knowledge that reality was stranger than she'd been taught, that the boundaries between past and present weren't as fixed as textbooks suggested. She continued collecting anonymous photographs, continued giving faces without names the gift of her attention. And sometimes, late at night in her quiet apartment, she would take out that final photograph Thomas had left. She'd study his face, frozen in celebration, raising a glass to a future he'd never physically inhabit but had managed to touch anyway. She thought about quantum mechanics and consciousness research, about temporal anomalies and collective attention, about all the scientific frameworks she'd explored trying to understand what had happened. But in the end, the explanation didn't matter as much as the experience itself. Thomas had taught her that memory, he'd believed, was a form of time travel. Every time we remember someone, we pull them back into the present. We make them real again, if only in the architecture of our thoughts. And if enough people remember, if enough attention and love and care is directed toward a person or moment, perhaps that creates something. A resonance, a weak point in time where past and present can touch. Perhaps that's all ghosts are, memories so strong they take on a life of their own. Love that refuses to let go. Attention that bends time. Mrs. McNulty lived another 10 years, continuing Thomas's photo restoration work until her own health failed. Before she died, she gave Sarah something: the entire collection of Thomas's notebooks, his calendars, his theories about time and consciousness and the persistence of awareness beyond death. "He'd want you to have these," she said. "You understood him in a way not many people did. You saw what he was trying to do." Sarah kept the notebooks in a special place on her bookshelf, between the Garcia Marquez novel and her collection of anonymous photographs. Sometimes she'd read through them, marveling at Thomas's mind, at the connections he'd drawn between photography and quantum mechanics, between memory and reality, between death and transformation. And every New Year's Eve, just before midnight, she'd raise her glass toward the bookshelf. A private toast to a friend she'd barely known but who had changed everything. To a man who'd proved that love was stronger than endings, that attention was a form of magic, that the dead and living weren't as separate as we pretend. To Thomas, who'd shown her that we don't simply disappear when we die. We transform. We become part of the architecture of other people's lives. We persist in the gaps and spaces, in the moments between moments, in the thin places where past and present touch. We become stories, memories, echoes, and in the right conditions, under the right circumstances, when the threshold is thin enough and the attention is focused enough and the love is strong enough. We came back, not as ghosts haunting the living, but as the dead borrowing moments, stepping briefly into the present to remind us, you are seen. You matter. You existed here, in this specific moment, at this specific place. And even after you're gone, that will remain true. Author's note: this story incorporates real scientific and cultural concepts, including the Global Consciousness Project at Princeton University, quantum mechanics research by physicist Brian Greene and others, neuroscience research on time perception by David Eagleman, consciousness studies by Dean Radin at the Institute of New Tech Sciences, Einstein's theory of relativity and space-time, cultural traditions around death and remembrance from multiple cultures, Japanese Obon, Mexican Dia de los Muertos, Celtic Samhain, and the history of early photography including daguerreotypes from the Civil War era. While the specific story of Thomas McNulty is fictional, the folklore motif of vanishing party guests is found in multiple cultures, and the phenomenon of deathbed visions and after-death communications has been documented in peer-reviewed research, though scientific consensus on interpretation varies. Hopefully, you have enjoyed this story. Visit us in a few days for a new story. Good night, and may your dreams be gentle.